tonight is Jane Jacobs. And let me start simply and personally. I had the great fun of meeting Jane Jacobs once in 2003. She was in the city doing some publicity, as all authors must, for her new book. And someone mentioned it to me. Now, at that point, I had given up writing the talk of the town, short reporting pieces that fill the front of the New Yorker magazine. I had done it energetically for many years before that. But when I heard the name Jane Jacobs, I instantly said, I want to write a talk story about Jane Jacobs for the simple and selfish reason that I wanted to have the chance to actually meet her. She had filled my mind for so long with the sense of everything a city could be, and I love cities probably more than anything on earth, as my good wife who sits here tonight knows to the pain of her Connecticut-loving heart. And I also have a double interest in Jane Jacobs, in as much as my family had left Philadelphia originally for Canada in exactly the same summer. I found out just this year in Robert Kenneal's biography, in essentially the same week, that Jane's family had left Hudson Street, left New York to go to Canada, and for many of the same sad and complicated political reasons that were so much a part of the temper of that particular time. So we had the double whammy of sharing a love of cities, having been instructed by her on how to love cities, and then having this double Canadian-American identity and having had our knowledge of cities shaped by the very different Canadian experience. Well, Jane Jacobs was everything you might expect her to be. As I wrote in the New Yorker last week, in a lifetime of meeting and talking to people, I have met 3 people who had the quality of saintliness, the quality of sainthood, that special mixture of tender emotional engagement and tough intellectual certainty that we associate with saints throughout the centuries. She was a wonderful person to be with, and whose aura was one that somehow combined enormous simplicity, complete lack of pretension, with absolute sureness. She believed in what she was saying, she was confident in her vision, and she brooked no compromises with it. I wish she could be here tonight because she would be so much more winning than I can be. But let me read you, if I might, just some of the conversation we had then, which I wasn't able to insert in the piece that I published in the New Yorker last week for reasons of space, just to give you perhaps a little of the taste of what it was like to listen to Jane Jacobs. She said to me on that day in 2003, I love New York so much still, but the traffic is the worst I've ever known it to be. New York still has so much pizzazz because people make it new every day. Like all cities, it's self-organizing. People looking for a date on 3rd Avenue make it into a place full of hope and expectation, and that has nothing to do with architecture. Those are the emotions that draw us to cities, and they always depend on things being a bit messy. The most perfectly designed place can't compete. Everything is provided there, which is the worst thing we can provide. There's a joke that my father used to tell about a preacher who warns children, in hell there will be wailing and weeping and gnashing of teeth. What if you don't have teeth? One of the children asks. Then teeth will be provided, the preacher says sternly. And that's the spirit of the design city, she concluded. Teeth will be provided for you. And some of you may know, and it's one of the most wonderful anecdotes about Jane Jacobs' girlhood, that she went on strike because she refused to sign a pledge to brush her teeth every night up in Scranton when she was a little girl. It wasn't that she minded brushing the teeth, she just hated the idea of having to pledge to brush her teeth night after night. The preservation of some of New York's communities I went on then, so threatened in Jacobs' day, pleases her, but their gentrification worries her. Whenever I'm here, she says, I go back to look at our house at 555 Hudson Street, and I know that we could never afford it now. She also admits that she still thinks about her old antagonists from those years, such as the city planner James Felt and the master builder Robert Moses. You have to understand, she says gaily, I have a very bad character. I'm an extremely vindictive person, so I still think of them with a certain hatred. It was a wonderful thing to have somebody who would speak that openly. I don't think people should have such a free hand with other people's lives. She believes that the fight for the soul of America is still on, and that it will be a battle, essentially, between cars and songs. our American songs are so strong, don't you think? She said. I often get sick when I hear comparisons of America to the Roman Empire. They were so much grimmer than we are, the Romans, so lacking in emotions and sentiment. Our songs and our cities are the best things about us. Songs and cities are so indispensable. Even if we went into darkness, the time will come when people will want to know how these ruins were made, the essence of the life we made. It sounds very conceited to say, but I hope that what I write will help people start back. Oh yes, my favorite song is Shenandoah. I hope that gives you some of the flavor of what it was like to spend time with Jane Jacobs. Wonderful, almost girlish simplicity and open-heartedness, and at the same time, enormous intellectual authority when it came to questions of how cities operate and what the future of cities should be. Now, I never turned on to Jane Jacobs, as I'm sure so many people in this room were, by reading Death in Life as a young man whose only dream in life was to get to New York, to get to Hudson Street, which I never actually did. But I got to the equivalent. I arrived in New York in 1980, and Jane Jacobs' book was one of the references I turned to again and again to understand not only how to live in the city, but why we wanted to live in the city. I was hardly alone in that pursuit. That book and Jane Jacobs' body of work was revelatory to two generations of city lovers and city dwellers. It was so revelatory, in fact, that it kind of bifurcated itself. So many people have loved Jane Jacobs' writing, so many people have been turned on by her vision, that it's sometimes hard to say exactly to which political camp or what political pole it ought to belong. I said in the piece that I wrote about her that by one of those wonderful serendipities, one of those fearful symmetries that William Blake, the poet, liked to write about. Her name can represent both the Jacobins, the most extreme left-wing cause in history, and the Jacobites, the most reactionary cause. And her work has been taken up by both ends. There are people who see themselves as utterly devoted to Jane Jacobs' memory, who feel that the core concepts of her work are to be against development, against the free play of capitalism in the city, to the constant reassertion of community, over commodity. But then there are people, if you read the libertarian magazine, the City Journal, they too make a fetish out of admiring Jane Jacobs. They see her as the oracle of the self-organizing city, as an enemy against centralization, an enemy against anything overseeing, an enemy against planning, who asserts again and again in her work the importance of the unplanned, the freely made, of people coming together and making their own communities rather than being told what kind of communities they ought to have. And one can read her quite plausibly, quite rationally, in either direction. But of course, saying that, though it's satisfying in some way, we say, oh, she suits many different ideologies and many different kinds. At the same time, we feel a little unsatisfied with that. We know that those differences can't be resolved quite so simply, so we want to go back and read her and figure out what she was saying. The aura of sainthood that she earned, and the aura of sainthood that she emanated, that sense of somebody with a mission and a vision, in a way worked against our understanding precisely what it was that she was claiming and exactly what it was that she believed. It went out into the world, into so many different corners, that we need to recuperate it today in order to distill out the essence of its wisdoms. Well, what are the essence of Jane Jacobs' wisdoms as they are revealed to us in all of her work, but particularly in The Death and Life of Great American Cities? It's so dense with wonderful empirical detail and observation that it can be hard sometimes to identify and isolate the continuities within the book. But I think if we look at it closely, we can discover three principles, if you like, that organize Jane Jacobs' vision in that life-changing book. The first is obvious, that cities are their streets. Cities are their streets. All of you, or many of you, I hope, will remember and relish that great section, one of the greatest and most inspiring sections in all of American prose, on the Ballet of the Sidewalk. That is the highlight of The Death and Life of Great American Cities in so many ways. All about the way that a single street, Hudson Street, as she knows it, has an incredible self-organizing intelligence, functions and changes in a way that's simultaneously completely free. Nobody is told what to do. Nobody is supplied with teeth in order to national. And yet at the same time has the delicate mechanical predictability, regularity, and inspiration of a dance, of a great ballet. Let me remind you a little bit of the rhapsodic beauty of that vision of the self-organizing street that Jane offered us in that book. Under the seeming disorder of the old city, she wrote, wherever the old city is working successfully, is a marvelous order for maintaining the safety of the streets and the freedom of the city. It is a complex order. Its essence is intricacy of sidewalk use, bringing with it a constant succession of eyes. The order is all composed of movement and change, and though it is life not art, we may liken it to the dance. Mr. Halliday unlocking the laundry's handcart from its mooring to a cellar door, first thing in the morning. Joe Crinacci, his son-in-law, stacking out the empty crates from the delicatessen. The barber bringing out his sidewalk folding chair. Mr. Goldstein arranging the coils of wire which proclaim the hardware store is open. The wife of the tenement superintendent depositing her chunky 3-year-old with a toy mandolin on the stoop, the vantage point from which he's learning the English that his mother cannot speak. When I get home after work, she goes on, the ballet is reaching its crescendo. This is the time of roller skates and stilts and tricycles, and games in the lee of the stoop with bottle tops and plastic cowboys. The time of bundles and packages, zigzagging from the drugstore to the fruit stand and back over the butcher's. This is the time when teenagers, all dressed up, are pausing to ask if their slip shows or their collars look right, and the time when beautiful girls get out of MGs and fire engines go through. This is the time, at the end of the day, when everyone you know on Hudson Street will go by. It's one of the most beautiful passages of prose, as I say, that I know in all of American literature. And here's the thing about it. When we read it today, we may think it's a little overpainted, it's a little MGM backlog in its enthusiasms. All of us who grew up in New York, or who emigrated to New York as pilgrims, know that it is essentially true. It was essentially true for a long time. I remember when I emigrated here with my wife in 1980, we moved into the smallest apartment in Manhattan, a 9x11 basement room where we lived for 3 years, the kitchen and the bathroom were part of the 9x11 space. And on that corner of 87th and 1st Avenue, which was still Yorkville in its old-fashioned confirmation, every day the traffic between the deli and the pizza parlor, between the funeral parlor that sat right beside us, which for some reason we never noticed in those years, but it stands out to me whenever I go back to revisit it. The way that the guys from Blanco's Hardware would get together with the guys from Weinstein's Hardware and Anna Maria Pizza in this form of friendly competition. That ballet went on every day on 87th and 1st, just as it did on Hudson Street. It really happened. So cities are their streets. That's the first great lesson, the first great principle we draw from Jacob's work. And when I say that, I mean not just obviously that cities are made up of streets. It's that kind of living street is the intelligence of the city. It's like the neurology of the city. Streets are the neurons of a city's life. And I mean that in a specific sense, that they're programmable, but they're also reprogrammable. They can change in use and meaning, not just over the course of decades, but as Jane Jacobs reminds us, in the course of a single day. What happens on the street can change. The guy who's opening the deli first thing in the morning is also the guy whose eyes on the street later at night. He's both a merchant and a protector, as much as the cotton would can be. Everything that happens on the street has multiple uses. In a very real sense, it has multiple meanings. A single stoop is an entryway to the building. It's a playground for kids to use, and it's late at night. It can become a passion pit for lovers to romance each other on. That capacity for multiple use, that capacity for plural intelligence, is what a street, a living street, provides for us. It's very difficult to duplicate. One of the things that Jane Jacobs always laughed about and joked about was the notion of well-meaning planners and developers that, oh, if we just put a corner store at the end of the block, all of these good things will happen. And her point was, it wasn't that simple. You couldn't replicate the sidewalk ballet with anything like that kind of reductive ease. First principle, cities are their streets. And we have to remember, and this is very hard for all of us to still recall, how radical an idea that was in the late 1950s or in the early 1960s. This was a time when streets were seen as slums, and the kinds of streets that Jane Jacobs is describing were seen as exactly what we had to escape to get into more rational, green, well-organized housing. And that was true for programs for poor people. It was also true for rich people. One thing that is lacking in every suburb, as I tell my wife night after night, including Connecticut, is a street. There is no street to go to. And when there's no street to go to, people seek out replacement streets, replica streets, like malls, as malls used to be, or strip malls. They seek out the experience of the street where no street survives. One of the points that Jane Jacobs made so beautifully in the book, too, was that we have such a hunger for these things that we'll buy into and buy simulacra versions of it. She made the wonderful point that the doormen who line Park Avenue are really hired neighborhoods. That is, they're people who do the function that the men and women of Hudson Street do for free, but because you pay them and put them in a uniform. They become the eyes on Park Avenue. Cities are the streets, and streets are the intelligence of cities. Second principle, density is an absolute good. Density is an absolute good. Now there again, that's something that I think we may nod at and say, yeah, I buy that, I believe that. Again, a radical idea in the late 50s or in the early 60s, at a time when density was seen as the enemy, especially by the most well-meaning and progressive of city planners and city developers. Densities and slums, again, were seen as identical. And the goal of good planning very often was seen to be to reduce density, to give people, seems logical, seems benevolent, to give people more air, more space, more sun. And that the only way to do that was to reduce the densities associated with neighborhoods like this one, and give people green space out in the suburbs, or to recreate the suburbs in one form or another within the city. Bring down density. And Jane Jacobs said, and she was truly original in saying this, many people had sung the street, though few as beautifully as she had, but really very few people had ever asserted that density was essential to prosperity. Density was essential to make a city safe, terribly important concept for her, and to make a city wonderful. Not only is density in itself a good thing, providing eyes on the street, providing varieties of occupations, Jane Jacobs believed and showed us that density enters into a virtuous circle with diversity. That if you had enough people living together, the plurality of interests that they would have would guarantee that there would be bound to be diversity in the neighborhood around them. I should add that neighborhood is a word that slips into one's tongue when talking about cities very naturally, but it's a word, interestingly, that Jane Jacobs did not like. She didn't believe in neighborhoods. She believed in cities and streets. That sounds kind of paradoxical, but she meant by that we don't really belong to a neighborhood. Our identity doesn't flow most often from a neighborhood. It flows from something much closer at hand, on the one hand, and then from the large organization of the city itself. So it's a note always worth remembering. We're inclined to say she was for neighborhoods, but she really wasn't by that name. Density and diversity enter into this virtuous circle. The more people there are on the street, the more interest they have, the more appetites have to be provided for by retailers, by clubs, by schools, by organizations. So the more kinds come in. So once you have density, this wonderful virtuous circle of density and diversity, exemplified on my old street on 87th Street and First Avenue, you truly had everything from nursery school for the children to a funeral home that you could pass through at the end, because the density of Yorkville in that time was so extreme that you had to have those things, and you had to have them pretty much on every block in the neighborhood. Density and diversity enter into this virtuous circle. Third principle that I think is essential to draw from Jane Jacobs' work, we don't have to surrender the city to cars. We don't have to surrender the city to cars. That's a terribly important concept for her, and there again, it's difficult for us to recreate the expectations, the mental context of 1959 to remember that that was a time when everything was being crushed and removed in the interests of cars. Everything from making parking essential in inner cities to building expressways that would knock down neighborhoods in order to allow cars entrance and egress from the cities more rapidly and more efficiently. And she stood up against the tyranny of the car and said, we don't have to surrender to the car. We don't have to surrender, most famously, to the Lower Manhattan Expressway. But more broadly, cities don't have to give up their identity to the automobile. They can thrive and survive without everybody having a car, without everybody having a parking space. Again, this seemed like a visionary, almost unrealistic expectation in 1959, but it's one that this city in particular has vindicated again and again. It's one of the ways in which New York remains still so distinct amongst American cities in some ways. We don't need a car to get around. And one fair reproach, I think, that you can offer to the vision in Death and Life of Great American Cities is that Jane Jacobs perhaps paid too little attention to infrastructure, to the role that the subway has as a kind of super street and allowing all of those other smaller streets to thrive. So those three principles, I think, are fundamental, formative to Jane Jacobs' vision of the city. Cities are their streets, and the streets are their intelligence. Density is an absolute good because it enters into a virtuous circle with diversity, and that the city can resist cars without dying. Cities don't have to accommodate to cars to go on growing and thriving and not remaining stagnant in any way. Quick digression, if you'll tolerate it, that I wasn't able to raise for all the reasons of space, economy, and editorial efficiency in the essay I published a week ago about Jane Jacobs. To my mind, the two best books ever written about an American city are The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is really about New York, pretty much exclusively, but not entirely, but essentially. And Rayner Banham's great book from exactly 10 years later, 1971, about Los Angeles. And I went searching the ecology of Los Angeles, the ecology of four, forgive me, I'm dropping the name now, but at any rate, Rayner Banham, the English architectural writer, wrote a great book about Los Angeles in which he tries to vindicate Los Angeles from the accusation of it being a non-city, a dead city. And he says we're just not paying attention to the right things. We have to pay attention to the way that Angelenos use those expressways and highways as kinds of streets, that their experience of them is essentially street-like. It's one of, as I say, that about Los Angeles, Jane Jacobs about New York, those are my two favorite books about American cities. And they were, of course, at loggerheads. And Rayner Banham was very brutal about what he saw as nostalgia or the excessive preservationist mania in Jane Jacobs' work. I can't find anything that Jane Jacobs wrote specifically about Rayner Banham, but I can only imagine what she would have thought about Banham's vision, not just of incorporating the automobile into the city, but essentially of an unconditional surrender to the automobile as a foundational principle of the city. But what's interesting to me is that at a deeper level, there's a certain commonality, because Banham's point was not that the isolation of the automobile was good. It was exactly that it was a failure on our part, on the part of Easterners, and particularly on the part of Europeans like himself, not to understand all of the organic and varied and multi-use ways that the car and the expressway actually exist in Los Angeles. It's, I think, an accurate and interesting, and finally, in certain ways, a Jacobian vision of how Los Angeles operates. Okay, those are foundational ideas. Those are the principles that we can take from Jane Jacobs' work, and as I say, they were all radical in their time and still remain inspiring to us today. But one of the things we never want to do is to allow even our saints to become sanctified. We don't want to allow any one thinker, any one body of work to evoke in us uncritical reverence. We want instead to do exactly what Jane Jacobs did every day of her working life, which is to look skeptically and irreverently at even the ideas that seem most self-evident to us, even at the principles that seem to us most obviously and inarguably true, including her own. What are the fair reproaches, I think, that we can make to Jane Jacobs' vision, we can make to her ideas? Well, one is historical, and that is that she was, we might say, sometimes and somewhat unfair to the aims and ethics of the planners who she so despised. So I wrote last week, Ed Loeb was one of the people who she most excoriates in her work and in her conversation, the urban planner and developer who did Roosevelt Island here, or fathered that, who did a great deal of work in New Haven and Boston, stands in the Jacobs literature for the devil himself, the top-down planner trying to force faceless concrete buildings on the good hobbits of the Shire. As Elizabeth Cohen, the Harvard historian, who's currently engaged in a long book about Ed Loeb, which I'm eager to read, I've been in correspondence with her, as Elizabeth Cohen points out, that's a somewhat unfair caricature of the real politics and the possibilities of city questions in that period. Loeb, and not unlike Ed Bacon in Philadelphia, genuinely had an inclusive, when I say a social democratic view, of what cities might be. They were obsessed with the problem of integration of the cities, pluralism of another kind, diversity, not just of retail, but of race. They were concerned with the question of how you build more city, more good city for more people, rather than just with the question, as they perceived it, of how you protect the thriving parts of the city from being despoiled. So that's one, I think, fair reproach we might make. It's a completely understandable position. One of the truths about Jane Jacobs' writing is that she was a wartime writer. She was necessarily a polemicist because she was writing at a time when, it's no accident that death comes before life in the title of her greatest book. When cities and their existence seem to be threatened at their core, when the possibility that cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston would simply collapse from inside and become wastelands, felt like a very real possibility. And I am old enough to tell you that if you weren't around to remember the crisis in the American city from 1965 till sometime in the late 1970s, you won't understand the context, the historical context in which Jane Jacobs was writing. Cities seem likely not just to change on the margins in their character, they seem potentially ready to be extinguished in their very existence, abandoned only to the very core. That was a commonplace of the period. That's what was happening to cities. Hard for us to internalize that now, but that's one of the reasons why Jane Jacobs was fighting so exclusively and at times intolerantly for her principles. So that's one fair reproach I think we can make, that its historical vision is sometimes limited. Another reproach, though, I think, is a little bit deeper. One's a little deeper. And that is something that we see all around us now. So many of Jane Jacobs' principles have been accepted, embraced. Her vision of the city is one that seems to us not merely positive, but in many respects completely familiar. And yet, when we look around our own beloved city of New York, we see that the principles that she held and the vision that she asked us to aspire to, the things she loved about New York, are threatened, vanishing, dying in another way. If New York faced an extinction of a kind 50 years ago, we all feel inside, I think, that it's threatened with another kind of extinction now. But let me read you, if I may, something I wrote in 2007 about New York. It was on the occasion of the report of the mayor, the group, what was called then the Green Plan. What seemed a little odd about the mayor's plan in the speech I wrote, I returned to the talk of the town to do this yet again, is that the one thing that leaves many New Yorkers worried, or at least uneasy, was nowhere mentioned. Perhaps because the mayor doesn't notice it, perhaps because that worry seems a little metaphysical and almost poetic. It is the sense that the city's recovery, New York's recovery, has come at the cost of a part of its identity. That New York is safer and richer, but less like itself. Like an old lover who's gone for a facelift and come out looking like no one in particular. The wrinkles are gone, yes, but so is the face. This transformation is one you see on every street corner in Manhattan, and now increasingly in Brooklyn too, where another local toy store or smoked fish emporium disappears and another bank branch or drugstore opens. For the first time in Manhattan's history, I was writing in 2007, it's only gotten worse since, it has no bohemian frontier. Another bookstore closes, another theater becomes a condo, another soulful place becomes a sealed residence. These may sound like small things individually, but the accumulation of them are the small things that the city's soul clings to. For by a city, we don't mean, or just mean, a place where many people live. We mean a place where many kinds of people live, all more or less on top of each other. Only 25 years ago, a walk from Tribeca to Soho and the Lower East Side would show as many kinds and classes, rich, aspiring, immigrant, as it had a century before. Now, that walk is likely to show only the same 6 stores, and the same 2 banks, and the same 1 shop. New York, I wrote, as generations have been taught by the then sadly late Jane Jacobs, is a self-organizing place that fixes itself. But let the additional truth be told that though the life of the block is self-organizing, the block itself that lets life happen was made by the hand of a city planner. As the mayor said, he knows, what we want the city to look like in 2030 will depend on the rules we make now. Aggressive policies for housing, especially low and middle income housing, a reasonable process of review to help neighborhoods remain neighborhoods, a less passive welcome to every form of monster store, more support for tenants and small merchants. All these things are worth arguing for and legislating for, too. I published that in New York in 2007, and I can't resist sharing an anecdote with you. I was sitting in my office about 5 days after it came out, and I think the Thursday after it came out, Monday. Phone rings, and I pick it up. Dutifully, no one ever calls me at the office. And it was the mayor. It was Mayor Bloomberg calling, because he was extremely offended by this piece. Now, I can't imagine that it would have had any life particularly, but he was offended by it because, to his credit, he felt that I was doing an injustice to the variety and plurality of New York that still existed because I was looking in the wrong places. And he summoned me to Gracie Mansion for breakfast. I went about a week later, and he very eloquently and powerfully and even plaintively made the case that there had never been so much good off-Broadway theater as you could find now in downtown Manhattan. That if we went to the Bronx, Queens, or Brooklyn, we would find all of the kind of variety that I was talking about, that I was essentially a kind of Manhattan bigot who was refusing to recognize the city as it grew and changed. I don't know if I buy it, but I will tell you that anecdote as an instance, since I have very little influence of either how passionately devoted Mayor Bloomberg was to the city or how hypersensitive he was to criticism. And I will leave it to you to decide which of those 2 things describes that exchange best. But that's the real problem, isn't it? That's the real problem that confronts us when we look at New York now. The end of diversity and density. I still live, for my sins, on the Upper East Side, on a slightly better block. But when I go back to my old block, when I look around my new block, I see that same kind of monoculture having sprung up where once there was an enormously varied and plural culture. We've lost our magazine store, we've lost our toy stores, we've gotten Big Dwayne Reed, 5 banks, and for some reason 3 European baby clothes stores. Why baby clothes stores proliferate when everything else is being extinguished is one of the great mysteries of contemporary Manhattan. My own theory about it is that they are part of the settlement and hedge fund divorces. But when we see that happening, and our heart shrivels under the weight of it, under the problem of it, we have to do the kind of work that Jane Jacobs would have wanted us to do. We can say about Jane Jacobs' vision that right now, that virtuous circle, which she believed was intrinsic to cities' life and to cities' growth, in which density necessarily created diversity, seems repealed. It's like the zero edge in economics. It's like a kind of anti-gravity. We have more and more density. We have as much density now as we've ever had. But we seem to have less diversity. It doesn't seem to be producing diversity in the way that Jane Jacobs expected it to, in the way that we've always been accustomed to. One of the things we do when we're struck with a problem is to try and get a broader view of the problem. And one of the things that has struck me, and one of the things that I think is significant, and I've been privileged to observe by being able to live in France for a long time and to travel some, not as much as I would like to, throughout Europe, is that we see the same pattern happening in almost every great major capital in the Western world. I had the great good fortune of being in Rome earlier this year, and some of you may know that Monte, one of the oldest neighborhoods, in fact the oldest neighborhood in Rome, is undergoing exactly the same kind of transformation on exactly the same basis that Williamsburg, say, has undergone in the past 15 years, or that my second neighborhood in New York, Soho, underwent 20 years earlier. And it's a source of exactly the same kind of distress and acceptance. On the one hand, the neighborhood becomes wealthier, it becomes safer, it becomes more affluent in every way. At the same time, the old culture of Monte, which stretches back in that case not as our neighborhoods do to the 1940s, but in that case to 200 AD, you have continuous records of families of people are being annihilated. Same thing is true in London. The same thing is true in my second beloved city of Paris. We see exactly the same kind of pattern. To reduce it to its simplest gestures, what seems to happen is that the very rich come in and drive out the middle class. And then the middle class, or the children of the middle class, come in and drive out the working class from the city. And we see that same pattern repeated, whether in the 19th arrondissement of Paris, or in the East End of London, in Monte in Rome, or in Crown Heights in New York. We see that same pattern replicating itself again and again. And trying to turn it into a simple polemical screed, trying to explain it or arraign its makers by turning it into a simple polemical screed against yuppies or against the bourgeois, clearly doesn't begin to make sense of the scale, the prevalence, the global reach of this particular phenomenon. Because, and here I think is the central irony of great American and great world cities at the beginning of the 21st century, the reason this is happening is because Jane Jacobs was right. Because Jane Jacobs was right. People want to live in cities. If cities are marginally safe and clean enough for people to live in, everyone, the rich, the middle class, the children of the middle class, aspiring artists, kids running racing from Oberlin, gays, transsexuals, everyone, immigrants above all, will want to come together in cities for all the reasons that Jane Jacobs so beautifully described. It is the place of slippage, to use her wonderful expression, a place where creative people, not coming together with a Manhattan Project-like idea in mind, but not knowing what their slippage together will produce, create. Cities are the greatest incubator for new ideas that have ever been imagined, and they're absolutely central to everything we believe about the production of prosperity and the continuation of personal serenity. Jane Jacobs was right, and yet the success of cities in so many ways threatens to undermine their ongoing variety and their ongoing health. I tried to say in that essay, and I know from having talked to a lot of people that it's easily misunderstood. I wanted to say, and I think it's terribly important, it's crucial, it's a little demanding as an idea, is that this is not a question of saying she was right or she was wrong and there's some other vision that's right. It goes deeper than that. It goes to the very nature of human values. Because the simple truth is that it's very often impossible to reconcile using one explanatory theory or using one encompassing vision very different values when we want both values at once. You see that clearly in San Francisco today, for instance. Everybody recognizes that we need new housing in San Francisco, but nobody wants it near their house. We have something like 85% agreement that we need new housing in San Francisco in order to stop the vicious cycle by which the new techies come in and seize up all the available housing, not through any sin or ill will on their part, but because they want to live in San Francisco the way all of us would like to live in San Francisco. Except those of us who already live in New York. But nobody wants to see that new housing being built in the part of San Francisco where they are. And as I wrote, the real reason that neither Jacobin nor Jacobite principle can solve this city problem is simply that the conflicting demands of liberty and of equality, freedom to live where you want and freedom to stay where you are, can't be simply solved or theorized away. They can only be empirically addressed. We should be in favor of freedom and equality, of our ability to make the street as we want it, and at the same time to invite all kinds to share it with us. But we can't pretend that each will produce or even complement the other. We can love the self-organizing street and believe in low-cost public housing, but it is an illusion to think that the self-emergent street of Jane Jacobs' imagination will naturally create affordable public housing, or that affordable public housing will guarantee a self-emergent street. The beautiful small ballet of the street depends on the liberty of people to live where they like, open stores as they choose, dance as they please. The demand to have decent housing in cities open to all means that city governments must build where they can, spend as they have to, zone as they think they ought to, cut corners where they must, plan and overplan, and engineer as they are able. It's a piety to say that these two terms, intention, should always be kept in mind at once. But some basic differences in what's desirable in human affairs can never be resolved, only reconciled on an episodic and empirical basis as best we can. That's where planning matters. And it's one of the real, and I think, true reproaches that one can make to her vision, or one of the honest criticisms that one can make of Jane Jacobs' vision, that though she participated throughout her life in politics, in her writing, she doesn't give us nearly as rich an account of the place of politics in city making as she gives us of the unplanned beauties of the city. Politics, I think, for Jane Jacobs often were Robert Moses telling moms where the expressway should run. Politics were people making you pledge to brush your teeth. And it's true, politics have none of the beauty of the self-organizing street. They're not a ballet, they're a battle, a permanent battle, but they are the only means we have to reconcile goods like equity and liberty, free streets and fair housing, that will never reconcile themselves. We need good politics and good politicians in another way. We need planning of a rich and Jacobean kind if Jane Jacobs' vision is to survive and flourish. I wasn't able to be here last week when my friend Paul Goldberger spoke on the question of Jane Jacobs' vision, looking more narrowly at the famous review that Louis Mumford wrote of Death and Life in our shared magazine, The New Yorker. But I was struck, not having known what Paul was going to say, not having been here to hear, that he ended up in a remarkably similar place to where I intended to end up tonight in talking to you. Paul said Jacobs' greatest contribution was in recognizing that planning was not able to do much except upset the natural equilibrium of places. Today, leaving it alone doesn't give us the city we want, the city that Jane Jacobs helped us to admire. Today, the natural order yields something very different from the highly diverse world Jacobs taught us to admire. For now, I think we can agree, Paul said, that these things no longer occur naturally, and that to keep them here, we need to do exactly the opposite of what she recommended. We need now to intervene. Those are strong words, but they can seem like empty words unless we put particular policies and politics, particular kinds of plans on them. We attach them. What do we really mean? We say we need good politics, good planning, in order to protect the unplanned, that we need intelligent planning in order to allow Jane Jacobs' self-organizing street to continue. Let me just throw two recent episodes at you as examples where I think working together politically, often top-down, we can do very good work for the Jacobean city. One that I was involved in is the High Line, the taking over the old train spur that ran through Chelsea and turning it into a promenade plantée, as they would say in Paris, into a long green street. Now, the politics of the High Line were immensely complicated. I blundered into them back in 2001, rather like that moment you may recall in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, when he picks up the red flag that's fallen off the back of an emergency truck and finds himself leading a communist parade entirely by accident. I had something like that relationship to the High Line. I went up to visit with a photography friend who was taking pictures up there in its completely abandoned state. This is only in 2001. They had to roll underneath a series of barbed wire fences as though escaping from Stalag 13 in order to get onto the High Line. And at that moment, the notion that you could turn it into a successful city park seemed beyond quixotic. It seemed simply pitifully unrealistic. And there were a couple of brilliant young guys in Chelsea who were pushing for it, and it seemed to have no chance at all. But then a number of things happened, not least 9/11, encouraging new kinds of plans and new kinds of planning in the city. Mayor Bloomberg, my erstwhile breakfast companion, had a specific vision, largely commercial in nature, of moving Manhattan west, of developing the western end of Manhattan. You may remember the failed plan to put the Jet Stadium there. So he was sympathetic to that. We had the blessing of Amanda Burden as a wonderful city commissioner who deeply believed in it. Lo and behold, all of those forces, some of them self-seeking, some of them altruistic, some of them wanting to see a park downtown, some of them wanting to see an amenity that would encourage development downtown. Lots of forces, as is essential, as is inevitable in a city, contradictory in motive, came together to get that park built. And I don't think that anyone can dispute that it is, on Jane Jacobs' terms, a complete success. Exactly because it is not a remote park on the Robert Moses model. It is a green street in the middle of Manhattan, one of the most beautiful green streets in the world, and is used in that way. I know that when my teenage son was still in the city, that's the place where he would meet his friends exactly as his grandfather would have met his friends here on the corner of Eldridge Street 100 years before. Highline, I think, is a wonderful example of some of the things we can accomplish through the marriage of politics, wise planning, and the self-generating city. Let me add another that would be more provocative as a suggestion to you, and that is those of us who love New York as it is, love cities as it is, tend to use the term gentrification only as a kind of curse word in a negative way. But I don't think that would be true to Jane Jacobs' vision if we did it. She wrote about the first stirrings of the phenomenon we call gentrification by referring to them by the beautiful, arresting, and surprising name of unslumming. How is it that neighborhoods that have fallen apart, how do they begin to come back together? And she described, with her usual brilliant penetration, exactly what that process would be like, where you had a neighborhood that still had a strong community core, where there were lots of bad old buildings. It's just very important that there not be good old buildings among, that there be bad old buildings that would be undervalued and therefore invite people and businesses to come in and take them over. And it seems to me that we do gentrification a terrible injustice if we see it only as a way of moving residents, as in Monty and Rome, out and allowing new people in. If, as it very often has, if you look at the simple empirical facts about it, if it enables us to increase density, if it enables us to take relatively low density neighborhoods and load them with a healthy kind of density, it can be an extraordinarily effective way of recreating, if you like, of spreading out and metastasizing the virtues of the Jane Jacobs cities into places where they might not currently belong. Richard Rogers, the architect in England and London, has a remarkable way of thinking about what we need to do is allow cities to grow into what he calls the brown lands, the kind of the abandoned industrial lands. We don't need to take over green space in order to allow cities to grow. Cities have room to grow and space to grow if we respect the principle that density is a good thing, not something to be avoided. Those are two throwaway ideas, or if not throwaway ideas, at least two pointers to where we can think in political ways about the city without abandoning or betraying basic Jacobean principles. But let me add something else before I conclude. We're sitting here together on a September night here in New York, and we all know that we are in the presence this fall, this year, of what threatens to be an extinction event for the principles and the beliefs that we all hold dear. One thing we can all say, wherever we stand on that left to right continuum of those of us who love the city in its plurality, its diversity, in its variety, in its capacity to take in all kinds and allow every kind and type, every race every religion, as this beautiful place continues to provide living evidence of, to transplant people from distant places, bring them onto this island and into this city, and allow them at once to recreate the culture that they have and to reimagine that culture in ways that they had never imagined before. One thing we can say for certain is that that vision, wherever on the left or right spectrum we fall, is threatened by Trumpism. That vision has many breaths, many sects, many political varieties. But we should never forget that Donald Trump first became famous for ripping apart treasure of Manhattan. That was his first gesture. And we can all, wherever we stand, Jacobean, Jacobite, or Jacobin, we can all agree that that vision of rapacious and predatory development is the antithesis of everything that all of us value about the city and of everything that Jane Jacobs stood for. We need to work together towards contradictory ends, for more housing and for the protection of our streets. Because the one thing we can say for certain is that a living city will never be a monoculture. It is a celebration in its very nature of pluralism, and it needs a politics as plural as its people. Thank you very much. Questions from all of you as you possibly can bear asking.
First of all, Adam, that was wonderful. Someday I'd love to sit and chew the fat with you because there are a few things that you probably see a little differently. But I'm curious why you think it is that people like Jane, who was not an expert in her field, and people like Rachel Carson, Ralph Nader, Marshall McLuhan, Betty Friedan, all these people who changed the fields they wrote about were not expert in that field. So quite an interesting phenomenon.
It's a fabulous question, Roberta, and it's a wonderful observation, too. We are blessed in America with what we might call a tradition of radical amateurs. And it begins with our founding. And, I'm sure a few of you have been able to wangle Hamilton tickets in the last couple of years. And one of the truths about the Hamilton and the founders is that they were making it up as they went along. I got to do a piece a few weeks ago about the New York Society Library, which is one of the crucial arsenals of the American Revolution in its earlier form downtown. So we're blessed with this radical amateur tradition. Franklin belongs in that tradition. Thomas Paine belongs in that tradition. Alexander Hamilton, who had to learn economics kind of through circulation through the library, is another. And all of the people you've mentioned as well. Why does it happen? Partly, and this is a non-answer, because we have a tradition, right? One encourages the next. You read Jane Jacobs and you're inclined to think, I don't have to have a degree in architecture and urban planning, in history, to have something valuable to say about cities. Now, critics of Jane's, as you know, say that that she sometimes crossed the line and was too ambitious in her theorizing about the past and the history of cities. That's another argument for another day. I would far prefer to have people who bite off more than they can chew than people who never open their mouths at all. But I also think that we were blessed, and I use were, the past tense, advisedly, carefully, with a certain kind of educational system that encouraged that kind of freedom of mind. One of the things you deduce from reading the recent biography, Robert Kniegel's biography of her, is that Jane Jacobs grew up in a small city that had enormous self-belief, and she grew up in a family that really encouraged the kids to think for themselves, that rewarded self-motivated thinking, that thought it was great when Jane Jacobs, the young Jane Jacobs, said, I'm not going to sign the toothbrushing pledge. They didn't think that was, they didn't say to themselves, she'll never get into Harvard now. They said, Good for her. Good for her. That shows character. That shows spunk. And I worry that our society, since our educational system particularly, has become so achievement-driven. Don't get me started on this, you'll get another 90-minute lecture. Has become so driven about achievement that it no longer encourages that kind of amateur planning. A friend of mine who's a college professor says that the problem is that we're a thick envelope society, meaning that the kids who get a thick envelope, meaning that they're accepted to a fancy school, see that as the be-all and end-all. Can't imagine Jane Jacobs or Rachel Carson or anyone else thinking that way. So we probably, I know the MacArthur's grants try to do this, but we should have a kind of Nobel Prize for the inspired amateur who brings ideas to us. Because you're absolutely right, it's one of the most vital of all American traditions, the tradition of the maverick empirical philosopher, theorist, observer, and Jane Jacobs is central to that.
Just to add, Jane once said about that issue, she said, insiders first are prisoners of the mantra that they've studied, but also they don't know how to ask the right question.
They don't.
The outsider does.
I think that's true. Well, you see it quite clearly in Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's hard for us to internalize now, Roberta, but that everybody said, we simply take it for granted that putting too many people onto a single block was definitionally bad, was definitionally what made slums rather than what made cities work. So that kind of duck-rabbit reversal, that basic figure ground reversal that's essential to real creative thinking, is not one that insiders can ever encourage, because the insiders don't have it, and they don't reward the student in the class who presents it. Someone else here, anybody on any subject here? Well, on this subject, but broadly conceived.
Sir, walking on the East River the other day for 30 minutes, looking across the East River, I counted 23 glass apartment towers.
Rising in Queens, do you mean, or along East River?
Queens and Brooklyn.
Right.
Isn't it now too late to intervene?
Did anyone hear the question? Is it too late to intervene? Has the city already been buried under glass and concrete and we'll never get it back? I could say yes, and that would be no way to end the evening. Obviously, I don't think so. Let me tell you why. 2 reasons. One is that inevitably, I have a dear friend who loved Paris, and he once said, everyone will always tell you that Paris was better 20 years ago, and it was always true. So, and I think there's wisdom in those words, right? All of us who arrive in New York in any particular time see that New York as the New York as it should be. You know, we arrive and we think that's the way the world is meant to be organized, even if, and one of the perverse truths about that is the people who arrived in New York in what was supposed to be the low point of New York, say in the mid-1970s, a time of high crime, blackouts, the taxi driver in New York have enormous nostalgia for it. They hate having lost the old Times Square and so on. We all have those feelings about our past. What I see when I look around New York is I'm impressed, and this is the only way those of us of a certain age can reconnect, is you look at what our kids do, how they live in the city. And one of the things that stuns me is that, I mean, the simplest kind of thing, and Jane Jacobs always liked to look at the simplest things, not the abstract things, is they know more subway routes than I ever did, right? I used to be very proud if I could do one switch off the shuttle, right? And they ride the R, the N, the Q, the B, the X, and beyond, because the city is open to them in that way. And they think nothing of going from Harlem to Bushwick, right, in the space of a single night from one friend's place to another friend's place, because the subway is safe, and because their friends live all around. That, for me, however much I may be equally depressed by the glass buildings rising in Brooklyn, or however much I may be depressed by seeing another Duane Reade opening on 2nd Avenue, that's an impressive fact. It was not a fact in anything like the same dimension 25 or 30 years ago. It was a fact 100 years ago, or was becoming a fact. If you read one of my favorite books about growing up in New York, two of my favorite books, Moss Hart's wonderful book, Act One, about growing up all the way in the southern end of Brooklyn, and and Alfred Kazan's great book, A Walker in the City, about walking from Brownsville to Manhattan day after day after day throughout the Depression. Those guys actually had a wider vision of New York, of necessity, than we've had since in lots of ways. But that's becoming part of the commonality of the new experiences. So that's the kind of reason, practical Jane Jacobs reason, that I'm encouraged, and I believe that it's not too late, that the city continues to grow and evolve in positive ways.
So to see the diversity, I have to
Expand.
widen my scope of things
Exactly.
to include.
Right. So to see diversity, it usually helps to expand our view. Gentleman here.
We have someone over there.
Okay, if someone, well, whatever. Roberta, why don't you pick the people out? I'll pick the people out. You can take them. Take them.
To follow up on this point, as a historian looking at this, Jane Jacobs' ballet on the street was itself the product of a very substantial change in the city that LaGuardia had brought. So that the elimination of push carts, the obliteration of the opening up, the city was much less dense in 1960. Also, you had
Than it had been in 1910.
than it had been in 1910, or when this building was built in the 1880s. So the city continues to have, and that was a political gesture since that time. So that I think one of the issues that raises for me as a historian is that the ballet on the street that we extol as a piece of great literature is not really where Jane Jacobs' principles are. It's a beautiful evocation of the city, but deeper than that, she had a deeper notion of how change occurs in that last chapter of Death and Life, about the kind of a problem that the city is. It's an amazing piece of work. And I think she gets trapped into we see that Hudson Street is a product of a very distinct moment. Immigration restriction had deprived New York of the kind of influx of people, right? It was a very different moment. And before that, in the 1880s, there was a series of these political gestures that could constantly have gone on. So I guess my question is, we can glom ourselves onto that beautiful vision, but that really the deeper principles that she's arguing for have to do with the self-organizing intelligence of the city. And so how does politics actually enter into that process? It's an issue that really needs more excavation.
Well, let me say thank you, first of all, because I think what you're saying is salutary and correct. Let me try and say two things about it. One is it's certainly the case that the moment that Jane Jacobs knew New York was a specific moment that depended on a very particular historical context. It's a New York of Jews and Italians and the Irish. And they had been in place as immigrants for a long time, and there weren't new immigrants arriving. And we see that as sort of the birthright of New York. Mr. Weinstein, whatever the butcher's name is. And of course, it was a particular historical bubble, if you like, that produced this. There's no question about that. At the same time, I don't agree with you entirely in thinking that that's the kind of epiphenomenon of Jane Jacobs' vision. The reason that she stirs and moves so many people is because she saw that, right? And not many people had seen that with that kind of intensity and understood that that was the thing that drew us to cities. And as I said in the piece I wrote last week, whenever I'm using my eyes and my mind to see how a city interaction takes place in sort of white-light way, right? That I gave the example, there's an outdoor Mexican restaurant that we like all the way up near Mount Sinai. And when you see how people organize themselves around that restaurant, who can sit on the stoop, who can't sit on the stoop, how the residents of the tenement allow people to sit when they don't, the whole back and forth of that very complicated kind is a beautiful piece of not just of city drama, but of toleration and pluralism at work, alive and on its feet. And Jane Jacobs, more than any writer I can think of, made us sensitive, made us aware of the power of those kinds of interactions. So that's one way in which I think that the ballet of the street isn't just a secondary thing, but it's central to her vision. Second thing I'd say about it is, I think you gave the answer yourself. LaGuardia had helped change the city, and those changes, which, as I was trying to say at the end of my talk tonight, were not necessarily altruistic, were not necessarily motivated by the reasons that we would want them to be motivated by, nonetheless had a very positive and powerful effect on the life of the city and the life of the street. And when I think about politics in the city, that's exactly what politics are. They're ways of bringing together very different motives and very different ambitions in order to arrive at something that we think reflects the common good. That's not an answer in a way, but it is a description of the process that allows it to happen. And again, I would cite the High Line, limited though that is, but it's one I was engaged with as a positive example of how that can happen. Cynics would say the only reason the High Line happened is because Mayor Bloomberg wanted to build the Jet Stadium. He got cheated the Jet Stadium and we got the High Line. I'm fine with that.
Although I have to say about the High Line, we all forget there are two guys who sat next to each other in a community board meeting, didn't even know each other, saw the plan to tear it down, looked at each other and said, "This is nuts," and they went to work. And fortunately, then their inspiration and their vision wound up Jacobsian at the core, inspired Amanda and then Bloomberg and then all the developers who opposed saving it. Oh my God, they're now coining money left and right, and they wanted it all down. But it's such a good example of a community-based, citizen-based effort with leadership that understood how to pick up on the bottom up and help make it happen.
I completely agree with Roberto. The only thing I'd add to that is it was a perfect example of how those two guys who are heroic figures in New York and should have a plaque to them because they had that quixotic vision. But the seed that they planted could only grow when you had the right kind of, when you had a political moment.
And leadership that grabs onto it. Absolutely. My definition of political leadership.
Hi, it's me again. Thank you so much. It seems that this valley of the street has disappeared from Manhattan. I happen to live on 57th Street in 90-story buildings. You're not going to look down and see a butcher. In fact, half the apartments are really empty. And as far as politics, the people who have the power now are not the politicians. It's the developers who pay the politicians so that they can get what they need. And I've been trying to find out what can we do. I said to people who were here when Mr. Goldberg was on. I've gone to every community board. I've sent the address to every politician, twice to the mayor, home and in office. But I don't, as very, very high officials said, Eleanor, don't try to get the zoning laws changed. You know, the sale of air rights allowed so much. The developers have all the power.
Well,
What do you suggest we do?
Not elect a developer president would be one of the first things. With that accomplished, and let's hope it will be. The second thing I think about is I don't have anything like as despairing a vision of city or the politics in the city as you do, and you may be right. But my own sense is, and I think I don't want to make a fetish out of the High Line, it's come up a couple of times tonight, and it's a nice illustration of that. Roberta's absolutely right. Every developer heeded the idea, fought in Chelsea, fought that idea as strongly as they could, until through the serendipitous intersection of visionary leadership from the base down and opportunistic in the best possible sense, leadership from the top. It happened, and then suddenly everything was the High Line, right? Live near the High Line, develop apartments. There are ways in which those kinds of pressures can actually persuade, nudge, push development in a more positive vein. That's part of the history of New York, after all, right? The purpose of Central Park was not to create Park Avenue, but that was one of the effects that it had. And I think that we can see, Central Park is another wonderful example of one of the great urban phenomena in the world that didn't depend simply on Jacobian principles of self-organizing. It depended on collecting the political will amongst the plutocrat class as well as amongst the population, the broad population, to make it happen. One of my heroes in New York is, maybe my greatest hero is Olmsted, because I think Olmsted is still the most misunderstood figure in the history of New York, because we think of him as the park planner, as a Sylvan visionary, when in fact one of the most interesting truths about Olmsted, about American life, is that Olmsted was a great writer, a great journalist, a great observer, who went south before the Civil War and wrote one of the great books about the South before the Civil War. And one of his central insights, it was that what the South was lacking, because it was essentially a concentration camp culture, were all of the kind of what we would call intermediate institutions, kind of the civic capital that was essential to have healthy and thriving cities. And he invented the most beautiful term I know for that whole world, that we sometimes call civic capital, social capital, called a commonplace civilization. He said that the health of a nation depends on the strength of its commonplace civilization. And I think and he built Central Park with an eye to strengthening and reinforcing that commonplace civilization. And I continue to place my hopes in it. And I don't share though I share your dismay as I watch what we refer to in our family as the oligarch's erection rising on Park Avenue. I don't entirely share your despair, because I can point to sufficient numbers of positive things to lighten my load. Gentlemen here. Either both. Here.
So a lot of the success of the Black Lives Matter movement has come from people on streets with cell phones. And I'm wondering if that's a nationalization of the watch street phenomenon, and what role technology might play in helping us rebuild the LA.
That's a very good question. I did an interesting debate for the, what was it for? I remember where it was, but I can't remember. It was, it was a good city group with Malcolm Gladwell about this very issue. And one of Malcolm's points, which I thought was very shrewd, is he says, we older eyes, right? We sometimes don't see commonplace civilization growing under our feet. And he said many of the things that were once accomplished by cafes and coffee shops are now accomplished on street corners with cell phones. That a lot of the work of intermediation, of communication are done in that way, and it's easy to miss it because it's not the way we are accustomed to seeing it. So Malcolm Gladwell felt strongly that was one of the ways that was happening. And I think that there's significant truth in that. All of us of a certain generation are inclined to see when we're on the street, and we see everybody looking down at their cell phone, that looks to us like alienation and isolation. But to another generation, just in the same way, may I add, that the teeming life of the city, the ballet of the sidewalk, seemed to many people, many old plutocratic people, not plutocratic people, but many old patrician people, when the immigrants were first arriving, it looked like horrible chaos, right? Horrible chaos. And it took better eyes to see, no, it wasn't chaos, what was going on around Eldridge Street. It was a form of another kind. And I suspect that that's true about the relation of the new technology to the city. One of the things that's striking is that a lot of people predicted and anticipated that with the spread, and it is the great event of our time, of whatever we want to call it, digital technology of every kind, that cities would become less optimal, they would become less necessary. A lot of people said that. Why do you need to be in a city? Because you no longer need to go to an office. Why do you need to be in the city when you can connect with the entire planet sitting in your basement or your bedroom in someplace else? Just the opposite has proven to be the case. All those techniques are pouring into San Francisco, creating an urban crisis, because they feel, in Jane Jacobs' sense, that the slippage essential to creativity will only take place in cities. So I think that, coming back to your question, I think that's a positive sign that we need to alert our eyes to better than we often do.
Over here.
Hi, I really support that notion that we have to look at it with new eyes. I actually have the pleasure of looking out for Bryant Park every day from the 20th floor. And
I'm sorry, which park is it?
Bryant Park.
Bryant Park, sure.
And so from the 20th floor, I get to see all these different activities, from people who've gotten in a meetup group and doing yoga in the park, to playing ping pong, to coming in afterwards and watching a movie. And they've all found ways of finding each other in a way we never did before. You know, if my mother had said I was going to sit there on a yoga mat by two people I didn't know in the middle of the park, she would think I was crazy, but in a way, those are my eyes on the street. I'm finding people that care and connect and look after each other in a really different way. I don't think we're ever going to get the butcher shop back because I shop Blue Ribbon. I don't have time to go to a butcher shop. But I do think that we could use some of her basic principles in different ways to create senses of communities and eyes and places that people really care about in different ways. But we've got to think about technology and the way people live their lives now, and not the way we did before. So I think it's very true to her principles, but really in a new environment.
Yeah, I think that's true. My family would be shocked too to see me on a yoga mat in Bryant Park. With good reason. I used to work right by Bryant Park, and your description of it is exactly right. And it's become one of those great meeting places. I have another theory about it. It's like my theory about the hedge fund divorces and the baby clothes. It's that one of the things that's made those public spaces richer is the end of lunch. There are fewer places where you can sit down on 42nd Street now to buy lunch, to have lunch. There are those kind of classic coffee shops and trafts, as they used to be, are gone. Every place you go, it's like Pret a Manger, you take it out. And that always makes me uncomfortable, but I see the effect of it is it brings people together to have lunch in public spaces. That's the kind of larger value of the city that we're not always alert to. And let me add, just again, talking about, the generations pass and we don't always see what the next generation sees. My teenage daughter, for whom in order to get a room of her own in our apartment, I have effectively mortgaged every ounce of carbon in my body, leaves the house, when she's not actually going to school, every day to take her computer to the local Starbucks, where she spends her day doing the work that I would have thought she'd want to do in the room that we have desperately provided for her. But that doesn't work for her. And to be on her laptop in the presence of other laptop users is for her as vital a social experience as anything that Jane Jacobs describes. We need to broaden our vision and reattune our sensibilities very often to understand what's really going on in the city. Something here.
Hi, there are certain sections of Brooklyn that still contain very strong ethnic communities, whether it be the Russians in Sheep's Bay or the Chinese in Bensonhurst, and they do seem to have, or in Jews in Midwood, they still do seem to have a strong street culture. That's everything that Jane Jacobs has talked about and described. How do the issues of homogenization and gentrification apply to those groups?
That's a very good question. There's something of a difference there, right? Because her ideal street, her vision of Hudson Street, and let's put to one side how totally accurate it was, tended to be about heterogeneous communities, right? And that's one of the reasons why she mentions all of those varied last names in her description of it. She believes that people come from many different backgrounds. These communities you're describing tend to be much more, as you say, much more homogeneous in that way. And one of the questions that we ask when we think about the city is to what degree do you want to protect that kind of homogeneity, and to what degree is it something that has a natural in quotes there, right, kind of life cycle that is part of the organic changing of the city and of the city guard. Those are questions I think that really have a better Jacobite solution than they do a top-down solution. That those things tend to evolve in their own ways, simply for the reason that the generations pass and what the kids of those folks are going to want in their lives is likely to be, is guaranteed to be, different than what the current residents have. So I'm fascinated by those communities, and I fear and I worry about their transformation. As Roberta mentioned, I've just written a musical essentially about the transformation of New York and the difficulties of it. It's called Table. It's centered on a little restaurant that's going out of business in Manhattan. And a lot of it is set in Brooklyn amongst the feuding hipsters and Hasidim in a single neighborhood. That's part of the drama of contemporary New York. Someone here? Some folks?
Back here.
Wherever. Or back here, whatever. Yeah.
I live right next to the High Line on 24th Street, and And I moved there in 1995, so of course it was kind of a snoozy little area. I remember Giuliani talking about what he called the underused West Side.
Right.
So of course I had this concept of sylvan fields with sheep grazing in them, and it really wasn't that. Although now, of course, what I see is I look out my window and instead of seeing the George Washington Bridge, I now see 10 Hudson Yards. And
Including your view of the George Washington Bridge.
it's gone.
Yeah.
No more bridge. But when I moved into the neighborhood, what was also there were all the NYCHA houses. And I remember my brother going, oh, you can't live there. There's NYCHA houses that's a block away from my house. Well,
I'm sorry, you must forgive my ignorance. What's a NYCHA house?
New York City Housing Authority.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, public housing, sure, right.
Yeah.
Right.
But a few months ago.
I do know those. I know exactly the buildings you're referring to. I have heard you refer to them.
The Hudson North Fulton House.
Sure.
A few months ago, I was walking down 28th Street, and I all of a sudden went, thank God for the NYCHA houses. Because basically what that's going to do, there was zoning. I mean, friends of mine worked for the city of New York when they ratified the West Chelsea plan. I remember seeing them that evening. And they go like this, they said, developers are standing here with pickaxes and shovels. And it was exactly true. That's what's going on in that neighborhood right now. But Hudson Yards, of course, is by leaps and bounds bigger than anything that we've ever seen. It's the largest development in the United States of America right now. But what I'm saying is that I'm kind of joyously happy about the diversity that is still left in my neighborhood.
Sure.
And also,
Even though it was supposedly an impediment to the welfare of the neighborhood once not that long ago.
Well, let's just put it this way. My apartment has gone up in value 10 times since I bought it, and it's a block away from the NYCHA houses, so it doesn't seem to make a difference.
But doesn't that make you a prisoner of your apartment in some ways?
Yes,
In other words, because...
we call it our golden noose.
Yes, exactly. That's lovely.
Yeah.
Golden news, right.
But the other thing is that I had a phrase about 15 years ago, and I do gardening for a living, so I propagate this. But what I called it was the suburbanization of Manhattan. And I am one of the people who is, front and center in making the suburbanization of Manhattan happen. And it's barbecues and picnic tables in people's backyards. So, and I've seen that, and of course, I don't like it myself. I can look and see all the things. I don't think that we will ever get commercial rent regulation, but at the same time, I wish that there was some kind of.
May I stop you there? Because you've raised a lot of points, and let me try and respond to some of them, right? Commercial rent regulation is one of the things I tried to study when I was writing about the city back in the early 2000s, and it's a bit of a minefield, it's a bit of a trap, hard thing to make work, because for all the good it does in protecting, it also does bad work in freezing things in place that you don't necessarily want to have frozen in place. I think that the process you're describing, there's a book called The Suburbanization of New York that outlines and describes the things you're talking about. I think that the two truths that I think are worth focusing on. One is that it's very hard, even for strict regulation, to change the exigencies of the city. I think the other neighborhood I knew best in New York was Soho. When I was living in Soho, after I left the Chinese department in New York, it was still very much a village of art. A village of art, and artists and art galleries. It was remarkably continuous in that way. The laws that demanded you be certified as an artist in order to get a loft in Soho have not been repealed. In fact, the board that enforces them is tougher now than it's ever been. Is Soho occupied exclusively by working artists? No, obviously not. So there's a limit. In other words, there's one of the kind of, I don't want to say unfortunate, one of the perverse effects of self-organization of the city is that it often repels well-meaning legislation and planning of all kinds. I think that in a broader sense, I think what Jane Jacobs might say if she heard us talking about the suburbanization of New York, she'd say, good. In other words, she'd say, thank God it's getting all those people out of the suburbs. In other words, her point would be, I think, that all the things that drove people to the suburbs historically are perfectly possible to have. Family lives, outdoor barbecues are perfectly possible to have in an urban setting. And we're better off having them, as both as people and as citizens, in an urban setting than outside.
We'll take one more question.
Thank you. In light of this gentleman's comment about the Elliott houses, I also live in Chelsea, and I've seen a tremendous change in the last 6 or 7 years. And I'm wondering if by any chance you've seen a documentary called Class Divide, which this is not advertising, but it's going to be showing next week on HBO. It's about the differences between the kids who go to the private school avenues, where tuition is about $50,000 a year, and the families who live on the other side of 10th Avenue in the Elliott houses who live on average on a family income of $20,000 a year. I also, like this gentleman, I say thank God for the projects because they keep us grounded. The reality that a city cannot just be the people whose kids are going to $50,000 a year private schools. I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts about how neighborhoods like Chelsea are now, Chelsea has the greatest income disparity in New York City.
2 things I'd say to that. One is, well, if you'll forgive my repeating in my own way, I think I wrote once, by a city we don't mean or just mean a place where many people live. We mean a place where many kinds of people live, all more or less on top of each other. But Mrs. Astor knew nothing of the Lower East Side. Of the Lower East Side, from the dream of Mr. Astor, Mrs. Astor, they were still nodes on one grid. In the course of any even semi-conscious wandering through the city, much less the kind of conscious wandering that marks the city's poetry and literature, from Walt Whitman to Alfred Kaysen and beyond, each group lumped visibly and tangibly into the other. And I think that that's been part of the spell of New York and part of its richness. As to the other question, I look forward to seeing the documentary very much when it airs on HBO. And I will add only, in conclusion, that I've often thought that if I were ever made the dictator of New York, much less be elected its mayor, the first thing I would do, you have to be the dictator, you couldn't be the mayor, would be to abolish all private schools. And I say that as a private school father, exactly because the moment when the, I hate the word elite, but when the richest people in the city had to share responsibility for the education of their children in the public schools with everyone else, we would see a revolution in public schooling. But I believe that that's part of what we mean by cosmopolitan experience. Thank you so much for coming.